Okay, well let's go and get started for the day. So announcements. Make sure that you get that fourth quiz done by tonight, 11:59 p.m. So it's over glycolysis. Okay, so make sure you take that. The second group work. So we had a group work on Monday. We'll have probably another one on next Monday. Okay, or this upcoming Monday. So plan on that again. We'll go over gluconeogenesis, another pathway. All right. I will also on Friday, I'm going to post problem set 1 on Canvas. I'll make the announcement on Friday as well. You'll get a week's worth of time to get that turned in. Okay. And then that's it. Okay. Let's go ahead and do this riddle. I have some questions about the recitations, possibly switching the times a little bit for those. Okay, so our riddle: I'm as small as an ant, as big as a whale. I'll dance to the music, though I can't hear. I'm as slow as a snail, but from me you cannot run. What am I?
A shadow.
A shadow. That's right. A shadow is it. Very good. All right, now go ahead and take out your response systems, your phone or whatever. I want to go ahead and ask 2 questions about the recitation sessions. So Zach, he was going to run his recitation from 5 to 6 on Fridays, but he had to, for other reasons, hold his at 4:15. About 15 or 16 of you there, and all of you said, oh yeah, this is a better time than from 5 to 6. So let me ask you this. So I don't want everyone to respond to this. If you were planning on attending Zach's review session from 5 to 6 on Fridays, could you make 4:15 on Fridays? That's the question. So if you weren't planning on attending Zach's at all at Fridays from 5 to 6, don't respond to this, okay? I have another question that you can respond to, but not to this one, okay? All right, so I'll give you 45 seconds. Go ahead and do that quickly, okay? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and, it looks like, we have 31 responses, so I'm going to go ahead and cut it off in 5 seconds. Anyone else? No? Okay. Let's go ahead and stop it right there, lock it up. Okay. All right. So we'll move Zach's review session to 4:15 on Fridays, okay? So I'm going to have to find a room for that, or I want to make sure that I can use the room that we originally planned to use, so I'll have to do that, okay? But 4:15 on Fridays we'll have a recitation section. Now, the other Zach Heslett, okay, he had only like 3 people or 4 people at his review session, so it seemed that Thursdays from, I think it was 4 to 5, I can't remember, wasn't the best time. So let me ask you this. Now this is for everyone. Everyone can respond to this. Could you attend a review session at one of these days? Now you can respond to this 4 times. So if you can attend all those times, even if you don't intend to come, go ahead and put those responses, okay? I'll give you 30 seconds to do that. On your marks, get set, go, okay? Mondays 1 to 5, Wednesdays 3 to 4, Thursdays 11 to 12, Fridays 9 to 10, okay? And then I might repoll this to really narrow it down. Okay. And remember, if you can attend multiples of those, then submit several responses. 5 seconds. Here, I'm going to pause it just to make sure that we got everyone. Okay. Still waiting. Okay, we're kind of leveling out here. Thanks, Ben. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and lock it up. That's 133 responses. Let's look at this, okay? I knew that was going to happen. Jeez. So it looks like a lot of those times would work for people. Let me do this. Let me pick the 2 most popular responses, Wednesdays 3 to 4, Fridays from 9 to 10, and reset this, okay? Clear results. So I don't want, so Mondays from 1 to 150 and Thursdays 11 to 12 are off the list now. Don't respond to them, okay? Respond to the other two, all right? And I'll give you 30 seconds to do that. We'll clear results, okay? And your marks, get set, go, okay? All right. Oh, not lock. Show results. Okay. Remember, Mondays and Thursdays are off the list. Wednesdays and Fridays are what we're looking at. And you can respond to both of those if you want. Okay, let's check that out. All right, I'll talk to Zach and see what he prefers, okay? Fridays from 5 to 10, or 9 to 10. Let me write these down. So Fridays, 9 to 10, or Wednesday, 3 to 4. And then the other Zach, 4:15. Okay. All right, so that's some stuff, bookkeeping stuff, administrative stuff that we had to get done, okay? I think I've given all my announcements. Where was my announcement list? Yeah, okay, great. Now we can actually talk about biochemistry, which is why all of you are here in the first place, okay? So let's go ahead and do that and talk about biochemistry. So on Monday, you all did that group work, the little worksheet. I trust that that wasn't too terribly difficult. I think that grades, I don't think the grades are done. I just haven't put them in Canvas yet. They're not up yet. So I'll do that hopefully today or tomorrow. We will put your assignment in MRB 111, the biochemistry home office, and you guys can then pick them up and see what you did wrong and come and talk to us and figure out, you know, what's going on. From the TAs that I have talked to that have graded these, they said that they looked really good for the most part, and that people seemed to understand what was going on. I will be honest, glycolysis is not a very obscure pathway. It's something that you have talked about, I'm sure, in other classes, all the way down into, you know, Life 102 and that kind of thing. So not terribly surprising that you did well on that. We are going to go ahead and review just the glycolytic pathway, just to give the high points of it, highlight some things, and then we'll step into some other aspects of the glycolytic pathway. And connecting pathways for that, okay? Including the fact that other carbohydrates can feed into that pathway. I had you go through glucose, but there are other carbohydrates that are of importance in our diet, and a mammalian diet. So we'll look at how those can get in the glycolytic pathway, right? So the glycolytic pathway, as I've already kind of mentioned, is really central to metabolism. It would be considered a core pathway. Certainly it's the start of carbohydrate metabolism. We are talking now about carbohydrate metabolism. Of course, we looked at how carbohydrates will be absorbed into our bodies and then also distributed throughout the tissues. Once into those tissues, if that tissue is going to catabolize that glucose, glycolysis is the first step of that. Okay, now it can do something with pyruvate, the end molecule of glycolysis. It depends on what tissue you're talking about. Pyruvate has lots of different fates in the cell. We will explore some of those fates, not all of those fates, in this class as we unfold these things. So that's just kind of the overview of what glycolysis is. There are lots of pathways that intersect glycolysis as well. And by intersect, I mean they share common intermediates. They either feed into the pathway or they're taking things from the pathway. Many amino acids will be broken down into one of the intermediates found in glycolysis. If you think about triacylglycerides, this is how we store fats in our body. The glycerol backbone of that will feed right into the glycolytic pathway as well. Lipids will not. Okay, so lipids are broken down into acetyl-CoAs. We'll talk about later on. All right, so the pathway. All right, let's go ahead and go here. Big picture, the pathway is 10 steps catalyzed by 10 different enzymes. 3 of those enzymes, as hopefully all of you recognized and found out, are irreversible. So I'm going to, or catalyze irreversible steps, I should say. So hexokinase is the very first step of the pathway, also what we call the trapping reaction in our last discussion, lecture 2. It is an enzyme that catalyzes an irreversible step in the cell. I think delta G of that is about negative 33 kilojoules per mole. There's really only one direction for this enzyme to go, and that's towards its product, glucose 6-phosphate. Okay? It is an ATP-dependent phosphorylation of that glucose, meaning it uses ATP. Okay. The next enzyme that would be catalyzed in an irreversible step is phosphofructokinase 1. Some of you may have left off the 1 and just put phosphofructokinase. The 1 is actually important. And the reason being that there's a phosphofructokinase 2 that we will talk about that does a very similar reaction, but it's different, and it's a regulatory step. So we'll get to that later on. I don't think that you were taking points off for that, but the 1 is important. Okay. Abbreviations also. You will see me or hear me use this abbreviation almost exclusively in this class, and that's PFK1. Okay. It's easier to say. It's easier to spell. Okay. All sorts of things. Okay. Phosphofructokinase 1 doesn't really necessarily roll off the tongue. Okay, so PFK1 is what you'd find in the literature as well. Okay. I would not ask that you remember all abbreviations. Okay, so I will try and give abbreviations on an exam that I would use in this class. If I don't, and you're like, "What is that abbreviation?" Just come up and ask me, and I'll tell you. Okay, sometimes I forget. All right, now, the final then irreversible step is catalyzed by this enzyme. Interestingly, it catalyzes the last step in the pathway, pyruvate kinase. Okay. And pyruvate kinase actually is generating ATP, okay, 2 moles of ATP. PFK1 is another ATP-dependent phosphorylation, this time of fructose 6-phosphate making fructose 1,6-bisphosphate. But those 3 enzymes are irreversible, and therefore they will also come up in future discussions on regulation because they do play roles in regulation. We'll highlight some of the roles that they play. We won't highlight all of the roles that they play in regulation. Okay? But those are the 3 irreversible steps. Now this slide, the way it's divided is divided by essentially phases: prep phase, payoff phase. Most textbooks will divide the glycolytic pathway right in half. They'll take the first 5 steps and they'll say that's a prep phase. Some textbooks will say energy investment phase. And then the last 5 steps, last 5 enzymes would be considered the payoff phase or the energy generation phase. Either of those terms are perfectly acceptable. Personally, I think that energy investment and energy generation are more descriptive of what's going on, but I'm fine with either of them. Okay. So prep phase and payoff phase. Now some of you, as I walked around and talked to some of you and had questions from some of you in the group work, some of you had encountered figures that had split the pathway into 3 stages. How many of you ran across something like that? Oh, okay, so I talked to all 1 of you. Some of you. Okay, so there's a couple of you. The worksheet directed you to 2, so maybe you didn't look for 3. But there are some books that will do this into thirds. And what they'll do is they'll take this reaction catalyzed by aldolase, and sometimes they'll put triose phosphate isomerase in there, and they'll say, well, that's the cleavage step or cleavage phase. And by cleavage, this is an important topic. Cleavage, we mean by essentially splitting. Okay, fructose 1,6-bisphosphate is split in half by the enzyme aldolase, making the intermediates glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate and dihydroxyacetone phosphate. So glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate is this guy, and dihydroxyacetone phosphate is this guy. Okay, abbreviations for these. That's G3P is a common abbreviation for this. Dihydroxyacetone phosphate, DHAP, is a common abbreviation for that. Okay. You also see this. I didn't really mention this, but I'll go ahead and say this. This will sometimes be abbreviated F16BP. Okay. But that would be the cleavage step. Glycolysis, the word means sugar splitting. So this is a pretty important step from that standpoint. Take a 6-carbon molecule, cut it in half. Okay? Now with that in mind, let me go ahead and ask you all this question, just to kind of engage you into what we're talking about here. So let's do this. Okay? What will happen to the forward rate of triose phosphate isomerase? I'll go back to that slide. When glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate dehydrogenase oxidizes G3P. How much time did I give you on this? Oop, minute 45. Okay, so let me go ahead and put that in full screen so we can see this. What will happen to the forward rate of triose phosphate isomerase when glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate dehydrogenase oxidizes glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, or G3P? Okay, I'm going to give you a minute 42. I'll go back to that slide so you can see those enzymes. Okay, marks, get set, go. What do you think is going to happen? Talk to your neighbor about that. Here's the slide. Okay. Happen to the forward rate of triose phosphate isomerase when glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate dehydrogenase oxidizes G3P. What do you think? You can talk to your neighbor about it. Shy away from that for sure. Is it going to go up? Is it going to go down? What's going to happen? You have 45 seconds left. I got 16 responses, so. About 20 seconds left. You only got 53 responses. I might give you a little bit more time here. Let me pause it at 10 seconds. I'll give you about 20 more seconds, okay? What do you think? Is it going to go up? Is it going to go down? What's going to happen? All right, 11 more seconds. Here we go. Counting down. So submit something if you haven't done so already. 3, 2, okay, 1. I'm going to expand this so I can see what people's responses are here. I'm going to put this here, save that. All right, save. What? Show results, that's what I wanted. There we go, all right. Okay, the reaction will make more G3P, it will increase, okay. Incremental in rate will increase, Le Chatelier increase. So let's read this big long one. Since glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate is a reactant and the reaction is being pushed toward the products, the equilibrium will be pushed towards the reactants. So the rate will go backwards. Okay? Increase, it will be reduced. The forward rate will increase. Lots of people are saying increase, increase, up, decrease. Some say decrease. Okay, so let's look at our word cloud. Check this out, see what the most often given word is. Increase. All right. So we'll increase. What will happen to that rate? It will increase. Now, let me go ahead and show you what we're saying here, okay? So glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, G3P. I'm going to come find some blank space here. Actually, I can do this up here and down here. About G3P. G3P, or glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, is the substrate for the enzyme GAPDH, glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate dehydrogenase, which is fun to say and spell. Okay, GAPDH is easier to say and easier to spell, so we'll use that abbreviation. But it's the substrate for that reaction, right? And that reaction is reversible, but it's going to make what we call 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate. We'll go look at the chemical structures of these here in a little bit. Okay, in the forward direction, this is going to require NAD plus as an electron acceptor, making NADH. Okay, and again, the enzyme that's catalyzing this step is GAPDH. Okay? Now, the question was asking is, well, what happens to triose phosphate isomerase's rate if this reaction is going in the forward direction? So this is going to that direction, right? Well, let me come back here. The enzyme triose phosphate isomerase is going to take this DHAP, and that is held in equilibrium with glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate by the enzyme triose phosphate isomerase, also called TIM. I don't know why, but it is. Okay, but triose phosphate isomerase. So what is essentially happening here is this. If this is going down because this is happening here, then that's going to drive this reaction in this direction. So the forward rate of that step will increase. So increase is the right answer. Go up would be another way to say that, according to Le Chatelier's principle. Okay? Because this step here, GAPDH, is draining G3P, which then means that DHAP will be converted to G3P. Now, the reason that I asked that question is because if anyone had problems organizing the pathway, they typically are at this step here. Okay, this triose phosphate isomerase step. And what do we do with DHAP? Okay, because this glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate is pretty clear what happens there. That's going to come over here. Okay, and it's going to be used in this reaction, and it's going to become this guy, 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate. Okay. But what happens to that DHAP? Well, there's another enzyme that's just going to siphon that DHAP, one of the products of aldolase, and it's going to siphon it into G3P. So this, okay, enzyme here is going to essentially catalyze this in the forward direction. Okay. Nope, they've got this written wrong. Oh, that's really confusing. They put G3P on top. So this, it'll go like this, and then that will come this way. Okay, yeah, question?
Ultimately, to move forward, it has to be in the pink background.
Oh, okay, so the question is, ultimately has to move forward, it has to be in the pink background. So the background meaning the way this textbook has written this, right? So what you're seeing here is the green here and the green here. That's right. That's not going to move through the pathway. That has to be converted to another molecule of G3P. Yeah. Okay. So everything really, as we look at this aldolase step and this cleavage step, right, that will funnel directly into G3P. So by the time step 6 starts, step 6 being here, catalyzed by glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate dehydrogenase, right, we have made from glucose 2 G3P molecules. Okay. Now that's not to say that DHAP doesn't have other fates in the cell, it does. But if flux in glycolysis is going up in the forward direction, then much of that DHAP is going to be siphoned into G3P. Okay. Aren't sentences in biochemistry great? Right? I mean, think about the sentence I just said. Much of that DHAP is going to be siphoned into G3P. Oh, it's like a stupid language that we're speaking, some weird stuff. But like I said, you pick biochemistry as your major. Okay. Questions on that? This is not an insurmountable, certainly, obstacle, but I had a couple of conversations about this with several groups. So I wanted to point that out to the whole group. Okay? All right. Now, you'll notice then stoichiometry, right? So we got stoichiometry here, that reaction catalyzed by GAPDH, okay? So I'll put our little abbreviation here, GAPDH. Okay, it's going to make 2-NADH. That'll be a topic that we're going to talk about here in just a moment. Okay. After that, as you look at the stoichiometry, everything's 2, right? So we got 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, because we split the molecule in half. We got 2 here. Okay. Now, let me say this. I'm going to poke some fun at some biochemists here and biologists and that kind of thing. This molecule here, 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate, I'll circle its name and its chemical structure, that's a high energy compound, right? Which means that, right, we should draw it with light beams coming out of it, right? Something like that. You see this kind of stuff. This is a high energy compound, okay? And because of that, then it is capable of using that energy to make ATP, and that's what we see in this next step, phosphoglycerate kinase, which makes 2-ATP. Now understand, when we say high energy compound, again, it's not going to like send shockwaves into the cell and magical things happen. This is based off of the fact that this phosphate group here, okay, this guy right here at the end of 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate, is a really excellent leaving group. All right, and so the enzyme phosphoglycerate kinase will take ADP, and it'll take the last phosphate on ADP, which has a negatively charged oxygen, and it will use that oxygen to nucleophilically attack that phosphate. And it will come off quite readily and quite spontaneously. And that will then make ATP. We're adding a phosphate to ADP. Okay? So high energy compound, the delta G of hydrolysis of that phosphate is at standard conditions negative 49 kilojoules per mole. Really high. You compare that to the standard free energy needed to make ATP in the cell is 30 and a half, or not in the cell, but at standard conditions is 30 and a half kilojoules per mole. Okay, so there's more than enough energy in that nucleophilic substitution reaction to make ATP. Okay. Now we could then have a very, very similar, if not identical, conversation with this phosphoenol pyruvate, another high energy compound. I'm going to draw lines coming out of this, okay? Phosphoenol pyruvate is another high energy compound. The enzyme pyruvate kinase couples the hydrolysis of that phosphate again with ADP and makes ATP. Okay, and we get 2 more ATP from that. And the end result then is pyruvate. Okay? But those are your 2 ATP producing steps. And keep in mind though, for one glucose, keep our stoichiometric coefficients correct, those reactions are going to be catalyzed 2 times. So you're going to get a total of 4 ATP made in what would be considered the payoff phase or the energy generation phase. You use 2 ATP in the prep phase or energy investment phase, which means that you're going to make a total of 2 ATP or net of 2 ATP, as well as a net of 2 NADH, which we'll talk about how that molecule can go on then to lead to the production of more ATP. Okay. NADH carries electrons. So GAPDH carries out a redox reaction. NADH carries electrons from the the oxidation of the aldehyde on glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. Right. There's a significant amount of potential energy in this molecule because it can give up electrons to electron acceptors. And it has a pretty weak affinity for electrons, okay, relative to the things that it can give it up, especially oxygen, which has a really high affinity for electrons. Okay, so it's a very favorable reaction for that to give up electrons later on in other compartments of the cell, and we'll look at that. Okay? Questions? Isn't that awesome? I mean, so cool. And that's just one of many. Yes, question?
I feel like the enzymes that catalyze the production of ATP from 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate are misnamed.
Okay.
I think they should be called phosphatases.
Yeah, okay. So the question or the statement is why is this phosphoglycerate kinase called a kinase? Wouldn't it make more sense to call it the phosphatase? It's moving phosphates around. Same with this, right? So it turns out that when these enzymes were discovered, right, and put into a reaction vessel, they, right, at standard, I'm not sure exactly how the reactions went, but this is how it's been described to me why they're called kinases. They were first observed catalyzing the reverse reaction. Okay, so in other words, ATP was being hydrolyzed by these to then make 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate. So the direction in the cell was not understood when they first were discovered. And so they were called kinases rather than phosphatases. And that's true of many of the enzymes that we'll encounter. They seem to be misnamed because it seems like they're named for the reverse reaction. Okay, and that's what we're seeing here. Other questions? That was a long time ago. I don't even know, honestly, when those papers were published. Probably in the 50s, or even before. So, probably before that. Edward Buchner was the guy that discovered this pathway back in the 1920s. So, that was before World War I. I mean, World War II. So, the roaring 20s. Anyway, other questions? No? Why don't we change the names? Well, because that would cause mass panic across the country, right? How do we change names? You just got to stick with what's historically there. Biochemists stick to the old things. I mean, we still call amino acids DNL. We stay away from the RNS system. We don't like change. I guess we're just a rigid group. So, welcome to the rigid group. Don't change stuff. Okay. Now, let me go one more step here. I want to say this because this is going to be important in terms of building you into something else. So pyruvate is our end product here, 2 moles of pyruvate for every 1 mole of glucose. Pyruvate is an important molecule, has lots of fates, but is also what we call an alpha keto acid. And alpha keto acids are going to be common molecules that we will see in metabolic pathways. Now let me go ahead and show you what I mean by alpha keto acid if you have forgotten this. Alpha keto acids take on this structure. Okay, they have a carboxylic acid followed by a ketone and then something else, R group. Okay, pyruvate, the molecule of interest here, is this. Just add a methyl group to that, and that's pyruvate. Okay, let me draw out another one. Just going to keep adding carbons to this. Four-carbon molecule, very important intermediate in many pathways. Another alpha keto acid is oxaloacetate, OAA. Also an alpha keto acid. I'll draw one more. Draw it here below. Add one more carbon to this whole thing. Oh, I'm sorry. Red check minus for me. I just realized I made a mistake. Sorry. There we go. I caught it on this one down here. It's carboxylic acid at the end of these. Okay. I got so excited about comparing this to pyruvate. So oxaloacetate has carboxylic acid at the ends of it. Okay. This one here that I just drew is only a carbon longer than that, and that is another very important intermediate in pathways, and it's alpha ketoglutarate, or alpha KGA. We're going to encounter these actually later on in this lecture, and then later on in another lecture, and another lecture, and another lecture, and then several other lectures. Okay, so we'll see them a lot. And let me just show you one aspect of this, just in comparison. Let me draw this out. Okay. All right. All of you are looking at that and saying, wow, that looks really familiar. That must be glutamate. Great job. One of the acidic amino acids, right? That's glutamate. And the reason I'm showing you that is to highlight this. The only difference between that alpha keto acid, alpha ketoglutarate, and glutamate, and that looks like I put glycine, that's not glycine. GLU, there we go. The only difference is essentially the placement of a ketone versus an alpha amino group. Okay? These are actually one enzymatic reactions away from each other. It's called the transamination reaction. Very important in amino acid metabolism. So we'll get to that. I'm building a case for even what we're going to talk about in our next couple of slides as well. Okay? I can do the same thing with oxaloacetate, replace the ketone with this setup, and I have aspartate. Okay. I could do it with pyruvate, and I get alanine. Right? So alpha keto acids and their connection to amino acids. There's right when you get into amino acid chemistry and biochemistry, you have these relationships between alpha keto acids and amino acids. Okay. Fun stuff. Questions? No, yeah.
Fluoxetine is stage 2.
Yes.
Okay, sorry.
Well, you can't read that? Here, let me draw it again. You're going to be picky, are you? You know, so here's an interesting story for you in terms of handwriting. So, you know, my son, my oldest son, this was long time ago. He was in kindergarten, and and actually it's first grade, I'm sorry. He was in first grade, and he really did not like coloring. I mean, he just hated the process of coloring things, okay? And so he would go to school and he would come home and he'd have these like little assignments that were like coloring assignments, right? 2 + 2 is 4, color all the things that are 4. And so we had our first parent-teacher conference, and I said, my son hates this. It was like an argument every time he has to color something. It's just, you know, torturous to him. Why is everything so intensive in coloring? And then I went on to say this, I hated coloring as a kid too. And she looked at me and she said, I bet your handwriting is really bad. And I said, well, how did you know that? And she said, because coloring is really good for developing fine motor skills, which is very important in handwriting. So there you go. So all because I didn't color, and now you're all suffering for that. But too bad. So it's just the way it is. And it's ingrained in me now. I can't go back to first grade and color. And neither can you. So if you didn't like coloring and your handwriting's bad, then you know. You know what I'm talking about. Okay. That has nothing to do with biochemistry. Absolutely nothing that I know of anyway. Okay. Are there any questions about my coloring abilities? Yeah?
What happens if you liked coloring but your handwriting still sucks?
You have to talk to Isaiah's first grade teacher. I don't know. So I don't know the answer to that question. Okay, now let's do this. Wow, time is flying. Pathways that feed into glycolysis, right? We started here. What you did yesterday, we went there, and then we went there. Hexokinase was our enzyme, and then we just went down the list. Okay? Certainly there are other pathways that are going to feed into this. All right, let me highlight, I'll highlight a number of these, but let's look at this. Endogenous glycogen, we'll look at this pathway because our liver and our muscle tissue stores glucose as glycogen. Glycogen can be broken down by an enzyme called phosphorylase, which will be your favorite enzyme come glycogen metabolism. Phosphorylase makes glucose 1-phosphate, and then phosphoglucomutase makes glucose 6-phosphate. And then from there, everything's the same. Okay, we can say the same as starch or glycogen that you derive from your diet. Okay, starch is obviously something that we eat quite a bit of. Amylase, though, can break down starch into glucose. Okay. Now, other pathways, I'm not going to highlight necessarily the names of enzymes here, but galactose is a very important sugar. Actually, if you drink milk, it comes from lactose. Lactase will break down the disaccharide lactose into glucose and galactose. Okay, there is a couple of enzymatic steps to get that to glucose 1-phosphate, and then the mutase takes it on to glucose 6-phosphate. I'm not going to name those enzymes, but they are present. Okay, mannose is another sugar that can be in a diet. Hexokinase, mannose is actually a substrate for hexokinase. Okay, that can convert it to mannose 6-phosphate, and then phosphomannose isomerase can convert that to fructose 6-phosphate. Again, I'm not terribly concerned that you know the names of all these enzymes. I'm just trying to expand your repertoire in terms of understanding that glycolysis is carbohydrate metabolism, not just glucose metabolism. Okay. Fructose. Fructose, in some health circles, is the F word. Right? Okay, it's also found in the sugary drinks that we consume at probably too high of a rate in this country. But fructose is a substrate for hexokinase and can become fructose 6-phosphate. But the preferred metabolic route of fructose, especially in the liver, is through this enzyme called fructokinase, because fructokinase has a much lower Km for fructose than hexokinase has Km for fructose. Okay? So this route, now I will say this is an interesting route, okay, because it's going to go there, and it's going to come here, and there's all this wonderful stuff, but it funnels right into glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. And you all say, yes, I see what you're going there. Why is that important? Why do you care about that? Why are you telling me that? All right, so the reason is this. Hexokinase, and then this step right here, I'll go ahead and write it out, and then put it on this. PFK1. These are the two regulatory steps at the very top of the pathway. Notice that fructose metabolism in the liver cell is bypassing both of those. Okay? So there has been very good evidence suggesting that diets high in fructose will lead to lipid metabolic abnormalities. And by that we mean higher than normal triacylglycerides in the bloodstream, and can also lead to obesity. Okay? It has been demonstrated that those conditions in rats in particular will lead to type 2 diabetes. Okay? In fact, rats fed exclusively on a diet of fructose will develop typically type 2 diabetes because of the abnormalities of lipid metabolism. Right? Some of the hypothesis for that is that, well, this bypass of the top two regulatory steps of glycolysis increases flux through the glycolytic pathway, okay, in somewhat artificial way. That then is going to produce pyruvate, and pyruvate in the liver cell, when there's a load of it, it's going to be made into fat, okay, and shipped out into the bloodstream. We'll talk about those things later on, okay, but I wanted to go ahead and point that out to you now. Questions? It's okay to drink Pepsi every once in a while. Just don't drink 96 ounces of it on a daily basis. I guess it's illegal to do that in New York City. That's what I would consider an overreach of government. But anyway, that's not anything to do with biochemistry either. All right. No questions? Awesome. Let's do this. Let's set up the stage here for Friday, and then I'll let you go. Okay? So they're connected to glycolysis. We have to think about how NAD and NADH is going to be used in the cell. Right? So let me do this. Here's glycolysis. You take the glucose or some other sugar, as we just talked about, and you make 2-pyruvate from it. Awesome. You're going to make 2 ATP in that process. Okay? You're also going to do this. You're going to make NADH, as we discussed. Okay? Awesome. Now, something I haven't mentioned, but hopefully you recognize because you did the worksheet, and that is that all of that takes place in the cytosol of the cell. Again, we're dealing with eukaryotes. We're dealing with mammalian eukaryotes in particular. Okay? What I just drew off to the right would be the two membranes of the mitochondria. Outer membrane, the straight one, and then the wiggly one, the inner membrane. High resolution structure of these things, okay? Now, the outer membrane of the mitochondria comes equipped with these very large transporters that we commonly call porins. Okay? Porin. Porins are big. They're big holes through the membrane, and because they're so big, they're not really selective in what they allow through. Essentially, small molecules, intermediates, okay, of pathways are held in equilibrium between what would be considered the intermembrane space and the cytosol. Okay, these environments are very similar in terms of overall composition because of the porins found in these membranes. Okay, so NADH is one of these things. It can fly right through there, no problem. Okay, now here's the interesting thing. Okay, let's come to here, and we'll put on the inner membrane of the mitochondria, trust me, we're going to go over this in a lot more detail, but we'll just put a pink box for right now. Okay, and we'll label that pink box. Actually, we'll just label it OXPHOS. Okay? Oxidative phosphorylation. Electron transport chain, ATP synthase, pink box. Not a black box, a pink box. Okay? And we'll develop the pink box later on. Now, that is going to do this with NADH. It's going to take electrons from that NADH. It's going to pass those through a wonderful process to oxygen. That'll make water. Ignore my stoichiometry because it's not right. But anyway, that's what's going to happen. And, oh yeah, that's right, it's going to make a whole lot of ATP, that process. Okay? Lightning molecule. Now here's the interesting thing. I'm going to say two things. Obviously, NADH can be used in the mitochondria for production of energy in the form of ATP, or the storage of energy in the form of ATP. Okay? So it'd be nice if we can get NADH from the cytosol into this environment so we can make more ATP. The other thing is this. NAD plus is in pretty limited supply in the cytosol. And if the cytosol runs out of NAD plus, glycolysis will come to a screeching halt right at the beginning of the payoff phase. It won't make any ATP from it. Okay? So it's important that NAD plus be resupplied, okay? And it's important that we also get that NADH from the cytosol into this environment. Now here's the fun part. Boink. NADH cannot and will not go through directly the inner membrane of the mitochondria. Furthermore, okay, the NAD plus in here, that would be nice to get back into the cytosol so we can resupply it, does the same thing. It bounces right off of that. We can't get through it. So what we will do starting on Friday is we'll start to think about, well, how then do we get NADH into the matrix of the mitochondria, and how do we get NAD plus back into the cytosol? And there's some wonderful ways to do that, and you're going to love them. Okay? So remember, that'll be Friday, group work on Monday, more than likely. Okay? All right. Have a good rest of your day. Stay warm. And hopefully, if you can, dry.